Hello everyone, it's Religious Fanboy here again, and welcome to Episode 8 of the Church Hunt Prep Podcast. And today we are exploring the concept of Constantineism, as well as its history, origin, the way it's looked like in the history of America, as well as its connections to the Persian Empire, as well as exploring the statement that is made by Hauerwas and Willman in their book Resident Aliens, where they say that Constantineism is not only something that Christians don't need to mourn, but is something that we can celebrate because it enables the church to more effectively fulfill the job of the church, as well as sharing a bit of my testimony, specifically in regards to doing ministry at anime conventions as a way of wrapping up the episode on a positive note. And our guest today is a close friend and mentor. He serves at Christ Church, and he is a third-time guest of the podcast, my friend Levi Sharrock.
Well, good morning, Quentin. It is good to be back and talk with you about a topic that I'm going to be learning a little bit more about as well.
And I am mostly going off of memories from college. So
Perfect. Okay, so where do you want us to start?
Let's talk about, to people who don't know what of the term Constantineism, we should probably talk about what's the definition of Constantineism. Constantineism is the concept of a nation or a location where you can genuinely assume by default that everyone in that place is a Christian. And the name Constantineism comes from Emperor Constantine of Rome, who is famously the first Christian emperor of Rome, as well as the first person to legalize Christianity in the Roman Empire.
Correct. He is the first one that makes Christianity legal in the Roman Empire. He's not necessarily the first emperor to make Christianity the official religion of Rome, because that doesn't come till later. But that's a good distinction there. But yes, some still question whether or not he was truly Christian or not. But we still struggle with that today. And so, leaving that aside, we will just go with the idea that either way, he did make several changes in the empire that were very much in favor of Christianity.
I kind of want to dive into the suspicion of his motives a bit, where we don't have time to get into this interesting topic, but one of the things that makes his faith in question is that he wasn't officially baptized until he was actually pretty close to dying. And that was, some people have thought of this to be kind of a way of appeasing people, but we also, from church history, at this time, it was still very much a mindset that if you were baptized, that your sins were forgiven, but some people believed at that time that the only way for the sins you commit after you were baptized to be forgiven would be to experience second baptism, which was culturally believed to be martyrdom. But speaking of the influence of a religion and the preservation of one being a political move, I want to transition to our next bullet point, which is the connections between Emperor Constantine of Rome and specifically Emperor Cyrus of Persia, who in Jewish history, fun fact, is Emperor Cyrus is the only Gentile to ever be revered as a Messiah by Jewish people, or a messianic figure in the eyes of Jewish people.
I was not expecting that jump from Constantine to Cyrus, just being honest. You have me curious.
Yeah.
What is the connection here between Constantine and the Persians? Because the Persians would have been, 400 years or so before Jesus, and Constantine would have been 300 years after Jesus. So you have a 700-ish year time span. So what's the connection? What's your angle? What are you trying to get to?
one of the things, well, briefly talking about why he's considered a messianic figure, is because his overthrow of the Greeks was thought to be a prophecy, because in, I think it's the book of Ezekiel, there is a verse that says, the nation that delivers you out of exile will be greater than Egypt.
Google says Isaiah 44, I think.
And then we also see that we believe that the historical accounts tell us that it was not only the Jews' faith that Cyrus returned, thus ending a part of the Hellenization movement, but he also allowed the other nations in the area to return back to their ancestral and land-based gods as well.
So, just to clarify, technically the Hellenization hasn't happened yet, because Greeks come after the Persians. But yes, Cyrus was very, very important in terms of biblical history, because he does allow the Jews to come back to their homeland after the Babylonian exile.
Yeah.
And now, I mean, whether that was, the exact motivation, I don't know if we really know. You could probably make a case that it was more political more than anything, just because as a superpower in the world, you wanted to make sure you had people on your edges of your borders that would act as buffers between you and your enemies. And so the Israel plot of land is very influential, very important as you move from Egypt into the Middle East. And so it would make sense for Persia to want the Israelites to return back home, so that way you have a nice little buffer between Egypt and them. So
yeah, especially since you brought up that this stuff took place before the rise of the Greek Empire. No one had a navy yet, as we've been talking about in our current Bible study on the book of Jonah. People were quite afraid of water.
Well, yeah, it's the realm of
chaos and death,
and evil and monsters.
Yeah,
and dragons.
Yum.
So I'm just adding on.
It's okay. Kind of to move back to talking about the similarities. Another one is actually tax exemptions.
Once again, you are taking me in a direction I was not expecting. Okay, so what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts there?
Where one of the benefits in helping with Reconstruction was they didn't tax people as much, because a lot of the nations, especially Israel, were rebuilding. We actually hear many stories about this throughout the latter parts of the historical writing section of the Old Testament, specifically and famously with Ezra, in how Cyrus helped him with the process of the Israelites returning from exile, and then with Nehemiah and building the temple and the wall of Jerusalem. And we also see the tax exemption be something that Constantine uses as a way of gaining further favor with Christians. And we also see that this is a political practice that extends even to today, where churches famously also have tax exemptions. So we can kind of see how this has been a way throughout history of a way in which the political powers that be kind of gained favor with the church, and the church gained favor with them was through lessening the burden of taxes.
Okay. Yeah, let's circle back to Constantine, if you're okay with that.
Yeah.
So with Constantine, he kind of comes to power, rises to power during a period of instability where there's 4 people vying for the throne, you could say. And so he's trying to consolidate that and come out on top, because that system wasn't working anymore. And so he's trying to come out on top. And what you have is he has a vision of this, the Greeks, the Greek letter for the Chi and Rho, and he sees it in the sky. And apparently, as the story goes, he said, the vision was, with this sign you will conquer. And so he painted that Chi and Rho Greek letters, which is the first 2 letters of Christ, in Greek, and he painted it on all of his shields and military, army people, and they go off into battle and they win and they're victorious. So because of that, there is this sense that Constantine then, like Quentin said earlier, became the first Christian emperor of Rome, and worked towards solidifying the empire, but also doing it in a way that involved the church. He's the one that called together the many councils of the first church councils with the different bishops and priests and different things like that.
Where Santa allegedly, in big air quotes, smacked Aries.
Yes. And so you have this transition in the world, from just moving from a worldly, secular, well, not secular because that's more of a modern term, but a pagan, non-Jewish, non-Christian worldview, and now you have an empire that's moving towards Christianity. And so that's a big deal, definitely. And so I think based on what you've told me so far, you're kind of wanting to talk about this idea of Constantineism, of where you have this maybe joining or benefit of both the government, political government, and being influenced and led by the church in a sense.
Yeah.
Because you could say with Constantine, where before Constantine, you did not want to profess that you were a Christian unless you were okay to be either tortured or martyred, or it had social and political implications that were tough.
Yeah. Or if they were being accused of being cannibals, but that's...
Yeah. I mean, it was life-threatening.
Yeah.
It was not a low cost associated with identifying as a Christian. And so, when Constantine comes in and he changes that and makes it illegal to be a Christian, then now all of a sudden you start having this new set of challenges where it almost seemed, as the course of time went on, that if you wanted to progress in the government, in the empire, then you needed to be Christian. And so you also have this, now you have a very low cost associated with following Christ. And so to me, when we think about Constantine, the first thing that I think about is just that difference between when there is a high cost associated with following Jesus versus when there's a low cost associated with following Jesus, and the difference that makes in I'm going to say the purity of the church, and the in the mission of the church too. Because does that make sense? High cost versus low cost? Yeah. When it's going to cost you a lot, meaning it might cost you your entire life, then the church seems to have a lot more focus on being authentic and pure and following God.
I also wonder if that has to do with just culturally, like how modern church views and interprets the topic of whether or not God still does miracles. As kind of in place where it is unsafe to be a Christian, you find yourself in much more need of miracles than say in America, where we're as Christians we are pretty safe. Not there might be some special or tragic circumstances, but for the most part we're not in trouble for being Christians, especially to the point where our lives are in danger.
Oh yeah. Well, absolutely that matters, because in America we live in a low cost, for the most part, low cost environment in terms of our faith. And so what you get, and I don't know if Dietrich Bonhoeffer was the first one that used this term or not. Not that it was a new truth, but just kind of a rediscovered truth. But when you have low cost associated with following Jesus, like, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but grace, the grace of Christ, can become something that is viewed as almost like cheap, in the sense of we don't revere it, we don't respect it like we should. And so, everyone understands that Jesus is their Savior. But when we start talking about Jesus as their Lord, of submitting to Him and, finding our identity and purpose in Him and living in a way that would honor and reflect Him rather than for our own self, like, that's when we have a low cost associated with following Christ. That's when we tend to cheapen that grace, and we're like, we can go have fun and participate in these sinful activities or do this and that, and we can just ask for forgiveness because Jesus will forgive us. Well, when you have a high cost associated with following Christ, you understand that His grace was not cheaply given. It came with a high price, and that high price was His own life. And so when there's a high cost associated with following Jesus, you tend to also revere that grace as also being very costly. And so you consider the cost of, if I'm going to follow Jesus, it's because it's real. It's because when I'm going through sufferings and pain and even my own crucifixion, Christ is there with us. That His example, His Spirit, His presence is leading us through, and His grace is even more sufficient, leading us through those afflictions. And so to me, I think without having read the book Resident Aliens, my assumption is just they're kind of pushing back on this idea that having a government that is in favor or even very much closely associated with Christianity and Christian values and ethics, I'm assuming that they're kind of pushing back on that. That is not always the best for the church. And I'm sure there's multiple reasons, but to me, the high cost and low cost is one of the big reasons that I would say that it's not always beneficial for the government to be always promoting a Christian world. Now, I mean, I'm not going to say that it shouldn't, because that would be definitely could be a good thing whenever that happens. But it also, in the history of the church doesn't always do well with political power.
Yeah, we going back. I kind of said it like a joke when I brought up or when people called Christians cannibals, which in some circles is famously known for being the reason for the origin of Christian apologetics. But we also see, probably gonna do an episode on this later, maybe a short mini bonus episode, but we see specifically with that where, because of Christians being in authority and being afraid of losing people, they would call each other, based on denominational disputes later on, would call each other cannibals. But also we saw this happen with the Christians towards Jewish people once, like, after, like, time post Constantineism's reign, that they lived in fear of the new popularity of Judaism and started calling Jews cannibals.
Yeah, some of that also came from their own practices as, participating in the Lord's Supper, of taking and eating the flesh of Christ and drinking the blood of Christ. When you're eating flesh and drinking blood, that sure does sound like cannibalism.
Yeah.
And so when you hear rumors and snippets of what Christians are doing at the Lord's Supper, but you don't really truly know what that means or what that understands, or the symbolism behind that, like, it would be pretty easy to try to dismiss Christians as being cannibalistic because of a practice that they practice without fully understanding what that means. So
yeah, and I'm gonna do a hard cut.
Go for it.
Back on topic. Did you know that the popularity of Christianity and abstract art in America happened at the same time for similar reasons?
No, I was not prepared for that question either.
With that question, I'm going to jump to America in the 1950s.
1950s? Okay. What happened in the 1950s? Tell me.
Specifically, the Cold War happened.
Oh.
And a fear of the spread of communism. Which, as someone who studied up on communism might know, is that they both did not like abstract art. They had a high focus on Roman classical realism, but also, more importantly, in regards to the topic of today, Karl Marx is famous for saying that for communism to work, everyone would have to be an atheist.
I have nothing to add. I actually don't know much about the Cold War or about communism. So, this one's all you. You educate me on this one.
And because of this, we see this is around the time where the popular phrase, "In God We Trust," gets printed on U.S. currency, as well as the line, "Nation under God," is added to the Pledge of Allegiance, as well as the endorsement of pretty famous televangelists during the 50s and 60s, Billy Graham. As well as during the time of... Also during this time, the initial passing of Roe v. Wade would take place. And in protest of this, we would see the rise of the religious right. And during this time, in most parts of the country, we still had Constantineism, where, and this is where we most prevalently see it, both as a way of combating and addressing the fear of communism and the greater conflict within the Cold War.
I see the connection you're trying to make now. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts about what is that balance there of how much should we try to shape American politics around the Christian faith tradition and ethics and morals, and how much as Christians should we not? I mean, is that a question that I can ask?
I am glad you asked this question.
Oh, okay. You were waiting on it. Okay.
Because another point of Howard and Willman's book called Resident Aliens is the idea that the only political strategy the church needs is to be the church. I don't know if that actually answered your question.
I mean, there's a profound truth in that, yes.
And we kind of see throughout the time, a book that I recently read is Jesus and John Wayne, the history of, like, basically the white evangelical church in America, which covers similar information that we are going to be that we've been covering, such as like the rise of Billy Graham and religious right, and how like these things that initially came out of the fear of communism in America shaped a lot of the fundamentalist Christian denominations at the time, as well as shaped our government for a while, especially in its relationship with Christianity. Because prior to the 1950s and the Cold War, a lot of the Christians, like a lot of America was Christian, like that was still majority of the religion, but we don't see the government like pushing hard on that and like going out of their way to say we're a Christian nation really until like the 1950s and the time of the Red Scare.
Okay.
And then yeah, our thoughts. But we also, and another quote that I really like from the book Resident Aliens is they talked about like how the church interacts with other nations, where there is a story where there was a conflict within a ministry about like something in the regards to like passports or something preventing people from sharing the gospel with another nation or people group. And they talked about how like basically saying it's a shame for the church to be in a place where it believes it has borders. And basically the idea of like by the church being kind of like living in, but in other ways being like basically being in the world and being within politics but not being of it, frees us in order to in that way it frees us and enables us to be fearless and bold in doing what God calls us to do. And we even see this in time prior to Constantine, which they also put, there's a chapter dedicated to this, was how we see in this time that what we have now as basically the foundational systems of modern day prisons, schools, and orphanages were all established by Christians in a time where they lived in fear of their lives at the risk of being martyred on a daily basis. Are there any thoughts?
I'm still pondering and thinking about your, the church should not be concerned about its borders, or like the church has no borders. Like that's still that's a good thing to think about and live out, because yeah, I think personally I still struggle with that of like what is a Christian's role within the American country. But like I also understand that my identity, ultimately, it needs to be Christian first and American. Like I don't even know if it should technically be American second. Like I am an American, but I'm also a Christian, and that supersedes any allegiance I have to any other power or government. And so yeah, I mean, learning to maybe reclaim a vision of the church, of what is the church's identity, who the church is, what is the purpose of the church, and maybe a better, bigger vision of how the church impacts the world. I don't know, that's kind of some of the things that my brain is processing right now as you're explaining the connections between the last couple years, decades.
A thought that's been in my head kind of throughout the past couple weeks as I've been like mentally planning out this podcast episode was, I'm of the opinion that there is no place on the earth where people who are made in God's image are that God is not. Where basically, because we are all made in God's image, all people across the world, there is no place in the world where God is also not present.
Well, that's also just one of the hallmark beliefs about who God is that he's all powerful, all present.
Yeah.
His presence is everywhere, not because not just because humanity is created in his image, but because he is the creator. And so as the creator, everything that's created is within his presence as the creator. So yeah, I mean, wherever we go, we can see God. Some places are going to be easier to see God than others.
Yeah.
Because not every person is a child of God.
Yeah.
Because they haven't come to faith in him.
Yeah. We actually talked about that topic one of the days during my internship here.
Your memory is better than mine.
As we had talked about how, everyone is made in the image of God, but not all have yet to be adopted children of God.
Yeah.
And, the difference being basically having that relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of the idea of God being anywhere and everywhere, I'm gonna transition again to the goal of the religious fanboy ministry, and specifically my experience of doing sermons at anime conventions.
Are you sure you want that to be tacked on to the end of this one, or do you need to do a different podcast for that?
Oh, I'm going to tie it in.
Oh, okay. You tie it in. Let's hear it.
Yeah. So, with culture today, we hear terms like a culture war going on, right? And because of that, there are some places that Christians socially might not be, or at least the hearing of the gospel message, people in certain places would not be interested in hearing it. But basically what I've learned is the importance of learning how to care first. And I've been learning the lesson of that ministry looks different based on where you are. And kind of like with the idea in Resident Aliens, where the church and God's people are not its own place, but it is a island and a part of a larger secular community. And that is where God calls it to live, is be neighbors with the secular community, and that it is necessary that we live in that mindset in order to meet non-believers. And it is through a desire of the church living in its community within the larger secular culture that we are able to find common ground with non-believers. And through my experience of specifically doing anime ministry on YouTube and sermons at conventions, that I have been able to find ends into the secular world and be able to subtly and stealthily share the gospel with those who would feel uncomfortable at a church, as well as, had it not been under or within the Trojan horse of that common interest, would not want anything to do with the gospel message had it not been for that common ground. Is there a way that, like, any final words on, like, anything that we talked about that you'd like to say to, like, kind of help wrap things up?
I think the kind of how you were just talking about that common ground, I think that's always the important part, is there's always a place in our lives to relate to someone else and find that common ground. Because at the end of the day, we are still human. We, as Christians, we do struggle with pain, with hurt, with, everyday experiences of life. Now, the difference is we have the presence of God, the Spirit of God living inside of us. And so our lives should look different than someone who doesn't have the Spirit of Christ. But there is always a place of common ground to be had with someone as we go through life. And so we can find ways to share our lives with them, our passions with them, listen to theirs, but also just get to a point where when we are able to talk about the gospel and what it means to follow Jesus, or why we have chosen to put all of our trust, confidence, hope, allegiance in Christ, that we're able to, and we're able to use a common relationship between us. So yeah, I think you're spot on, Quentin. That common interest is key.
And as always, I hope that you take away from this episode whatever God intended for you to take away from it. And we would love to, if you feel compelled to visit and check out Christ Church. We have recently started adding another service on Thursday nights as we prepare for Easter in this season of Lent. And I hope that this episode was a reminder to you that regardless of what is going on in the world and in your life, that God has not and will never abandon you. And with that being said, may God be with you, and see you next time. Bye.